Today we're talking about the identity shift that precedes execution. And here's what nobody understands about why people fail. It's not that they lack discipline. It's not that they lack motivation. It's not that they lack the right system. It's that they're trying to execute from the wrong identity. And you can't force behavior to change when your sense of self is anchored in the opposite behavior. If you're someone who can see patterns in how people sabotage themselves, if you watch people fail at the same goals over and over despite genuine effort, if you understand why systems don't work for most people even when the systems are objectively good, then what I'm about to tell you will explain everything. Because execution isn't a behavioral problem, it's an identity problem. And until you shift who you think you are, no external change will stick. Let me paint you a specific picture. Someone wants to become a writer, so they buy a writing course. They commit to writing every day. They create accountability. They set up their space. They have all the systems in place. They write for a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month, and then they stop. Not because the system failed, but because the system was built on the wrong foundation. Because the person who showed up to write was still the person who has always been a non-writer. The person who thinks in terms of trying. The person who believes writing is something they have to force themselves to do. The person whose identity is still anchored in not being a writer. So when the motivation fades, when the initial excitement wears off, when writing stops feeling novel, their nervous system pulls them back to who they've always been. Not because the person failed, but because the person remained the same. Only their behavior temporarily changed. This is the fundamental mismatch that most people never see. You can change your behavior without changing your identity. And when you do, the behavior never sticks. Because behavior without identity alignment is like planting a tree in concrete. It might survive for a moment, but it has no soil to take root in. Here's what psychologist James Clear discovered when he studied habit formation. He found that most people approach goals backwards. They think, if I execute this behavior repeatedly, eventually it will become habitual, and then I'll be this new version of myself. But that's not how identity works. Identity doesn't follow behavior. Identity precedes behavior. Who you think you are determines what you're willing to do, and it determines what you sustain. Clear wrote, the most effective way to change your behavior is not to focus on what you want to achieve, but to focus on who you want to become. The goal is not to read a book. The goal is to become a reader. The goal is not to run a marathon. The goal is to become a runner. But here's what most people don't understand. You can't think your way into a new identity. You can't motivate yourself into a new identity. You can't affirm your way into a new identity. Identity shifts through a very specific mechanism, and that mechanism is evidence. Your brain updates its concept of who you are based on repeated behavior. Not one-time behavior, repeated behavior. Every time you write, your brain gets a tiny data point. Writer. Every time you post content, your brain gets a data point. Content creator. Every time you have a difficult conversation, your brain gets a data point. Someone who handles conflict. And over time, as those data points accumulate, your nervous system updates its prediction model. Oh, this is who this person is. But here's where it gets tricky. Your nervous system isn't neutral about this process. It resists identity change. Because identity is tied to safety. Your current identity is safe. It's predictable. You know how to be this person. You know how to survive as this person. A new identity is unfamiliar, and unfamiliar means threat. So even when you generate evidence of a new identity, your nervous system tries to discount it. One blog post doesn't make you a writer. One difficult conversation doesn't make you someone who handles conflict. One business action doesn't make you an entrepreneur. Your brain generates reasons why the evidence doesn't count. Why this is an exception. Why this doesn't really prove anything about who you actually are. This is what psychologist Dweck identified as the fixed mindset. The belief that who you are is fixed and unchangeable. And people with fixed mindsets, even when they take action toward a new identity, their brain rejects the evidence. So the action doesn't accumulate into identity change. But here's what's even more specific. Intelligent people are especially vulnerable to this trap. Because intelligent people have elaborate explanations for why they can't shift identity, why the evidence doesn't count, why they're still fundamentally the person they've always been. You take one action toward the new identity and your brain whispers, that's just an anomaly. You're not really this person. This action doesn't define you. You've always been someone who tries and fails, and one success doesn't change that narrative. So you end up in a state I call identity persistence, where you take real action toward a new identity, but your self-concept never actually shifts. You're doing the behavior of a different person, but you still experience yourself as the old person. And that internal experience is exhausting because you're living in contradiction. Your actions say one thing, your identity says another. And over time, the identity wins. Because identity is neurologically stable. Identity is what your nervous system defaults to when you're tired or stressed or scared. So eventually, you revert. You stop taking the new actions, not because you're lazy, but because your nervous system was never convinced that you were actually this new person in the first place. This is why so many people cycle through goals. They take new actions. Nothing changes internally. They get exhausted from the contradiction. They quit. They feel ashamed. They try a different goal. Same cycle, different label. Psychologist Albert Bandura identified something important in his research on self-efficacy. He found that people don't just build confidence through action. They build it through successful action that they attribute to their own ability. In other words, you can take action and not build confidence if you dismiss the action as luck or circumstance or a one-time exception. But if you take action and you actively attribute that success to your capability, your identity shifts. Because you're collecting evidence and you're allowing that evidence to update your self-concept. You're saying, I did this because I'm the kind of person who does this. Most people never make that attribution. They take action and they say, that was luck, or I was motivated, or the conditions were perfect, or that doesn't really count. And so the action doesn't become part of their identity narrative. It stays external, it doesn't integrate. So here's what needs to happen. You need to shift from trying to become a new identity to claiming the new identity first. Not through affirmation, not through belief, through deliberate action that you consciously attribute to who you're becoming. Give you a specific example. You want to become someone who finishes things. Your current identity is someone who starts and abandons. So you don't try to finish something big, you finish something small. You complete a task that you would normally quit on. You send an email you would normally delay. You publish a post you would normally refine endlessly. And then here's the critical part. You don't dismiss it. You don't say, that doesn't really count. You consciously notice it. You say to yourself, I did that because I'm someone who finishes. Not because I was motivated, not because the conditions were perfect, but because I'm becoming someone who finishes. And I just proved it. Every time you do this, every time you take action aligned with a new identity and then consciously attribute it to your capability, you're building what psychologists call a self-schema, a coherent narrative about who you are. And that narrative becomes the template for future behavior. Here's what happens when identity actually shifts. Execution becomes easy, not because you're more disciplined, but because you're no longer working against your own self-concept. You stop disappearing from yourself. You stop fragmenting into the person trying to do something versus the person who thinks they're not that kind of person. You become coherent, and coherent people execute. Not because they're special, but because their identity and their actions are aligned. Their nervous system isn't expending energy on self-protection because there's nothing to protect. You've already accepted who you're becoming. This is what I mean by they finally stopped disappearing from themselves. They stopped fragmenting. They stopped living in the contradiction between their actions and their identity. They became real, whole, coherent. And once you're coherent, execution stops being something you have to force. It becomes something you do naturally because it's consistent with who you think you are. So here's the move. You don't try to change your behavior, you change your identity first. And you do it through micro-commitments that you consciously attribute to your new identity. You identify the person you want to become, not in the future, now, today, in this moment. And then you take one small action aligned with that person. Not perfectly aligned, just aligned enough that it's undeniably the action of that person. And when you complete it, you don't minimize it, you recognize it. You say to yourself, I just proved I'm this person because I did this. And then you do it again and again. And each time, you're building a coherent narrative, a self-schema that your nervous system can align with. And slowly, the resistance fades, the internal contradiction dissolves, and execution becomes who you are instead of something you're trying to become. Because here's the truth that most people never understand. You execute at the level of your identity, not at the level of your goals, not at the level of your systems, at the level of who you fundamentally believe you are. Change that belief through repeated evidence and attribution, and everything else follows. If this explained why no system has ever worked for you, why you keep returning to old patterns, why you feel like an imposter even when you're executing, it's because you're taking action from the wrong identity. Subscribe. Next time, we're breaking down the psychology of why people who transform their lives always talk about a moment when everything clicked. and how to manufacture that moment instead of waiting for it.